Hi, Zizaran here with another Leaguestarter for the upcoming 3.20 Sanctum League for Path of Exile, and this is a collab with Minion Master Gazi. So this is going to be Summon Raging Spirits if you couldn't tell already, and obviously a very strong build. We are a Necromancer, and first, the upsides to this build, you get pretty fun clear. Obviously you have a lot of minions running around and helping you clear all the monsters in a map, and you get pretty decent survival early, especially for mapping. We are able to get either block capped or close to block capped on this build, so that feels really nice. However, as some downsides to this build is that the sustain doesn't get that nice because we really want the life on block on a shield to really like stay in fights for longer, and that'll obviously boost our survival for maps even more. Another downside is that in okay gear we do get around 2.3 million damage, which is definitely not enough for pinnacle bosses. So keep that in mind when choosing this build. But if you like minions and you like summon raging spirits, this is a super fun league starter, and it'll set you up to be able to either continue min-maxing this or go for other alternatives, like maybe you want to try golems or anything like that. And if you feel like all the guides we're doing help you have a smooth league start, please consider subscribing, and thank you so much for the support.
Starting off leveling with this build, you can utilize Spark if you mule a Pierce from the Ranger in the start, or you can just level with the Freezing Pulse and Orb of Storms or Frostbomb. At level 8, you're now able to get yourself a melee splash, which allows you to switch over to the actual Summon Raging Spirits to level all the way throughout the entire game. As you're leveling through and skilling into your passive skill points, you'll be able to pick up a node called Sacrifice. Once you picked up Sacrifice, this will allow your utility or meat shield minions such as Ray Zombie to actually reliably stay alive throughout the actual campaign. So at this point you're able to raise the zombies and actually have them reliably tank for you whilst your SRS are doing all the damage for you throughout the game. At this point you're free to run around summoning your SRS as they take care of the work for you.
So as per usual for the build guides, we're using Path of Building, and there is a step-by-step thing here where you can see that you see exactly where to put skill points as you're progressing, and ascendancies are bundled in there as well. So check out the different trees. And very, very worth to mention that all of these trees are made right before the 3.20 patch comes out. So when Path of Building updates, it's going to throw you a message saying this guide is for 3.19. Don't worry, these guides are all made with 3.20 in mind. Here in the skill section, we have loads of like different leveling skills. So this will help you keep track of what to use and what not to use, so you don't end up getting swamped with loads of gems that you're no longer using. And then if you don't know what muling is, that is like making a new character. So here you can do a new character like a Scion or Ranger and pick up Spark, Pierce, Onslaught, etc. But if you don't want to do that, you can just level the Freezing Pulse and Arcane Surge and Frostbomb. And then as we progress, you can see that we are switching to Summon Raging Spirits eventually pretty early, which is really nice because it is great to level with the gem that you are going to be using at the end game. And then you can keep paying attention to this and progress. And SRS is such a nice skill. As you can see, you're summoning loads of skulls and you're just running around right-clicking. And this is the damage setup. We're obviously not using an 8-link in this. So this is what it would look like for single target in a 6-link. And then if you are doing mapping, you would remove multi-strike and predator support and have unleash and melee splash instead. And with unleash, this is really, really nice because you're basically running like a few seconds, 3 or 4 seconds, and then doing one unleash. And what that does is it'll summon 4 Summon Raging Spirits. One thing very important to mention for this build, you do eventually want a trigger weapon. This is unveiled from Betrayal. Some people like to farm that already in Act 8 in Foothills just by holding control down and spamming like make new area, because a really cool feature is that as soon as Betrayal is found in the zone, it'll tell you in like the quest helper on the right. So that's why you'll sometimes see streamers spam Foothills over and over and over again, because if you can get it that early, you're going to have such a like nice leg up, as well as just unveiled gear can be incredibly strong. So that's how you sometimes see people have this like 3 or 4 hours into a league start. And one thing to mention, Gazi has a really good, more in-depth written guide for this, so make sure you check that out. And we'll put a link to that in the description down below, so that'll be even more in-depth than the actual video guide and this PoB. So Yazi, tell us a little bit about the utility minions, the Spectre, the Animate Guardian, and I see there's 2 golems here.
When it comes to the Spectre choice, it's pretty straightforward. They have temporarily set buffs or debuffs they apply. For example, in this specific scenario, we're only using 2 different Spectres. One being the Pale Seraphim from the Scourge, these days called the Beyond Spectres, that applies a debuff on enemies, making them take 15% increased damage taken. And the other Spectre being an Arena Master from the Drox influenced maps, for example, who provides an increased damage as well as increased cast and attack speed, which helps the damage output of the SRS, but also the cast speed of summoning the SRSs ourselves. However, these are not included in the descriptions on the custom modifiers inside the PoB to inflate the DPS numbers because they're not permanent buffs. The Animate Guardian himself is something that I would recommend any summoner build or player to use at any given time, including low-budget versions. However, it can be a bit daunting to go through, so there will be an in-depth description and a guide for this covered in my written guide, of course. The golem choice is obviously a matter of personal preference when it comes to this. I would strongly recommend the stone golem, especially before you are able to purchase or craft your own recovery on life shield, as that can be a bit expensive. So the stone golem provides a lot of extra life regen, as well as a taunt ability to make sure that enemies are actually hitting the golem rather than yourself or your minions, which will work very well in 3.20 Forbidden Sanctum League mechanic. However, if you do want some more damage, you can always neglect this extra layers of defense by adding a carrion golem for extra damage output.
Awesome. So as per normal for League starters, obviously the main thing that you're going to want is life and resist. And it doesn't really matter where you're getting the resist. Just make sure that you get resist capped. That's very important. And like I mentioned earlier about the trigger, and there's a lot of gear here that is like pretty basic. One thing that's definitely important to get is the life on block shield. But Yazi, talk to us a little bit about advanced gearing for this build and talk us through the gear.
When it comes to the gearing, it's very important to understand that certain things for minion builds are better than the numerical values that you see in PoB. So we can start with a weapon as an example. It has a plus level of all spell skills, which could be plus level of minion skills as well. This is actually less DPS output than a high minion damage roll on the wand. The reason we're choosing to run with a lower damage one is simply because the extra levels will increase the survivability of our meat shields or now our utility minions as well, which creates a really nice general approach to the gearing for the build itself. The trigger, as you mentioned before, from unveiling betrayal encounters, gets a trigger to automate our offering, which you'll have to self-cast before you get this craft. Shield-wise, it's also pretty straightforward. It's a life recovery on block. However, it can be a bit expensive and not something you should focus on until you start filling into the red tier maps. Before that, anything that gives you life or any needed attributes or resistances is obviously recommended, as you need to make sure you have 75% elemental resistances. And also, if you're overcapped on resistances, thanks to your gear, any sort of chaos resistance is always preferential. When it comes to the helmet, the bone helmet is one of the best bases you can use for this. Life is obviously very important on all of these rare pieces. Getting a modifier that increases the level of all your minion skills is absolutely the next modifier you'll be looking for. For the cheaper variant in this PoB, I've chosen not to include this. In the higher versions, you'll have +1, and even higher, you'll have +2 level of minion skills. Chest piece, I tend to focus on a tabula rasa for the super low budgets. Any corrupted 6-link you might be able to find or purchase will obviously be better thanks to extra layers of defense, life, resistances, or even attributes. Higher budget will most likely go into things like Covenant, which will cost quite a lot of currency. When it comes to the gloves, I tend to focus a lot on the armor pieces to help mitigate physical damage, but also focus on just life, resistances, and or attributes as needed. The boots themselves, same thing there, very generic, same as the gloves, except that you want to make sure the movement speed is as high as you can afford or find. Speaking of attributes, the amulet itself is one of the best pieces to get a lot of dexterity on, which is one of the things that minion builds in general struggles with. Don't forget the life roll, and in this case, the oil you put on this can be a variety of different things. I chose Arcane Guarding to help out with reaching as high block chance as possible. When it comes to the rings, again, focus on making sure you have a life roll on them, resistances and or stats as needed. And if you feel that you're confident or you have enough resistances across the board or even stats, or even able to find the better base ring with these stats on, the suggestion here would be to go for a bone ring. These rings will give you minion resistance implicit instead, and the possibility of rolling damage modifiers for your minions, such as minion damage or minion increased attack and cast speed, which will significantly increase the damage output. The belt itself is a to-go-to choice for almost all minion builds, which is a Darkness Enthroned, which will scale the increased efficiency of the socketed Abyss Jewels. in here, we'll be using Ghastly Eye Jewel, and similar to the approach of all our other rare pieces, it's very important that all of these Ghastly Eye Jewels has a life roll. Try to avoid anything below 20 HP and try to get the ones with more than that, and any sort of damage modifier, such as added flat fire damage or even added flat physical damage, they tend to be a lot cheaper than the better version being the modifier that says that you get increased damage when you've used a minion skill recently, which you will be spamming. Flask-wise, it's pretty straightforward. Rumi's Concoction has the available possibility to give you extra layers of block. However, in lower budget versions, you might find yourself not having a proper good uptime of this, so it's a rather optional choice to run with or not. I tend to like it. Having an instant life flask that removes bleeding effects, such as a laying or a sealing, for example, as the suffix is called. I just noticed this is not fixed in the PoB now. This will be sorted before the League launches. An Enduring Mana Flask, that is a prefix modifier that makes the Mana Flask not stop recovering your mana when you reach full mana. This is something that helps a lot in the early stage of this build to avoid any sort of mana issues when you start doing single target boss fights, because you will be spamming SRS so much that your mana will deplete. So an Enduring Mana Flask is definitely something you want to run. To further focus on our defensive layers, we're going to be using a Basalt Flask, as our Ruby's Concoction is a Granite. We can't use two of those. And the suffix modifier here is a Tortoise, which is one of the modifiers that increases armor during the Flask effect. This flask is definitely something you don't want to skip out on. Quicksilver Flask for the obvious choice of increasing movement speed. The Ghastly Eye Jewels will obviously be the last thing you'll be adding on the tree. Once you finish the generic nodes, you want to pick up as many jewel slots as possible to add more of these jewels. There's also a Quickening Covenant, in which is not a mandatory choice, but definitely helps with damage output and a little bit better defense versus spells for your minions. And the last thing, but not least, is the Cluster Jewels, whereas the Large Cluster Jewel is a minion passive with a renewal. Now, the modifiers on this jewel doesn't really matter too much, and the amount of passives, again, doesn't really matter too much. The reason we're using this on the low budget is basically to purchase or find the cheapest variant that gives you minion damage to dump in passive skill tree that you're leveling to give you extra minion damage. But most importantly is the medium cluster. The medium cluster needs to be of item level 68 or higher. This allows you to roll a modifier or notable called Blessed Rebirth. The amount of passives would preferably be 4 passives. The problem with this is that it can, in some leagues, be rather expensive, so I've chosen to add a 6 passive, which will always be hilariously cheap. The Blessed Rebirth, what it does is that when you've summoned a minion recently, those minions, in this case SRS, will be completely immune from damage taken from the enemies, and therefore, if you encounter hard enemies with a lot of AoE damage or stray projectiles, your minions will soak those, but not die, therefore creating a scenario of stable, reliable DPS output.
Awesome. That was really good. Thanks so much for watching the video, and I hope it gives you a really strong start on the upcoming Sanctum League. If you have any questions or you run into any problems, Gazi is the absolute minion master. So anything with minions, you go to his stream, he'll be able to help you. And he has such an in-depth written guide for this as well. We'll link to that in the description. So that should be everything you will need for minions. So huge thank you to Gazi. Make sure you check him out on Twitch and on YouTube. And really looking forward to doing more collabs with you in the future. And thank you guys so much for watching. Sub if you liked the video, but more importantly, try to die less than I do.